There have been a ton of new mountain bike products released this year, but this is the single piece of new gear that we're most excited to reveal. This is the all-new RockShox Vivid, back from the dead and ready to hit the trails with super plush, coil-like sensitivity, combined with a highly tunable, high-volume air spring. In this video, we'll review this new Vivid and try to answer some questions. Is this the one shock to rule them all, or just another attempt at making an air shock feel kind of like a coil shock? Stay tuned and you'll find out. RockShox originally gave life to the Vivid R2C in model year 2011 and then redesigned it for model year 2014. The Vivid has always been produced as a high-volume air shock with the intent on combining the best qualities of coil and air shocks into one tidy air shock package. To do this, RockShox created a high-volume air can, which created a super plush, coil-like sensitivity, but with the flexible and easy adjustability of an air shock. However, RockShox only continued producing the Vivid R2C in imperial shock sizes and never made them in the metric shock sizes, which pretty much every bike is built around these days, so it just kind of fell off the map. So what gives? Well, RockShox has been redesigning the Vivid from the ground up, and here with me now is the brand new RockShox Vivid Ultimate. First, I'm going to talk about all the new technology packed into this new shock, then I'll review how this shock feels on the trails, and finally, we'll figure out who the Vivid is best for. As mentioned, the Vivid has been rebuilt from the ground up, and this new shock is built off of its own entirely new chassis. There will be some OE models of the new Vivid like the Base, Select, Select Plus, and Ultimate DH, but in this video, we'll really just be talking about the Vivid Ultimate, since that'll be the main aftermarket option. Plus, if your bike comes without the Ultimate model, you can actually just buy this RC2T damper separately and then install it onto your shock. We see the Vivid Ultimate as the top tier premier rear shock option from RockShox, since it just has so much performance and so much tech packed into it. So let's start by talking about some of that new tech. This new Vivid Ultimate uses an RC2T damper, which offers 5 clicks of low-speed compression, 5 clicks of high-speed compression, 20 clicks of rebound, 5 clicks of adjustable hydraulic bottom out, and a 2-position climb switch. You'll notice that these are the same adjustments found on the RockShox Super Deluxe Ultimate Coil Shock, and the same on the Super Deluxe Ultimate Air Shock as well, minus the adjustable HBO, but that's where the similarities stop. Within the shock's damping circuit, the Vivid features what RockShox calls touchdown technology, which is a position-sensitive damping system with 3 zones. The first 10% of shock stroke minimizes compression damping to create an ultra-light force required to get the shock moving. The next 10% to 80% of stroke is tuned for stability and control, and the last 20% of stroke is handled by the adjustable hydraulic bottom out feature. They've also redesigned this high-volume Debonair air can to provide a super plush feeling off the top of the stroke, adequate support in the mid-stroke, and a more linear, consistent feeling throughout the travel overall. The high-volume air can makes the spring curve more linear than a shock with less air volume like the Super Deluxe Ultimate Air Shock over here, which makes the shock feel more coil-like and feel like it has more usable travel since it doesn't ramp up as much toward the end of the stroke. This is either a pro or a con depending on your riding style, which we'll cover a little bit more later. And of course, you can add or remove volume spacers to make the shock more or less progressive, so you can fine-tune just how linear or progressive the shock feels for you. When I first installed the Vivid on my bike right here, the first thing a bunch of us bike industry folks is going to do is push down on the saddle very slowly to see how easy it is to initiate the shock into its first bit of travel. And let me tell you, you don't even need to hit the trails to feel how insanely easy it is to get this shock moving. You can immediately tell how the new Debonair air spring and touchdown technology in the damper are working together to seriously make this thing feel like a coil shock at the top of its stroke, just by compressing the shock very gently on the shop floor. In all honesty, I've always been extremely impressed with how sensitive this Super Deluxe Ultimate Air Shock is while doing this same silly, non-scientific test, and it's actually nuts that this new Vivid tops that. Beyond performance on the bumps, the new Vivid has also been redesigned to prioritize durability. The new seal head and dust wiper design, along with an increased overall oil volume, have increased the air can service intervals from 50 hours to 100 hours. Now, I'm not very good at math, but that means that you can ride twice as long as shocks with a more standard 50-hour service before pulling the air can apart for a refresh. Home mechanics with just a couple of special RockShox tools can perform the 100-hour service with ease. Then there's still the normal 200-hour full damper rebuild interval times, which we still recommend getting taken care of by a shop with suspension-specific knowledge. The new Vivid is made in all the popular metric sizes and also available in a ton of bike-specific models with custom internal tunes to best suit the suspension kinematics of many popular bike models. The bike-specific models also include mounting hardware to make for a super easy install. Speaking of mounting hardware, RockShox is also now making an M8x30 bearing hardware, which comes in handy for frames that are designed around that. Previously, bearing hardware was only ever built into the shock's damper body on RockShox shocks, which was honestly a huge pain in the butt. But this new bearing hardware can be installed into any RockShox Vivid or Super Deluxe Coil shock. The Vivid is also approved for use on e-mountain bikes, so there's no need to go searching for like an e-mountain bike specific model or anything. All right, now it's time to move on to the review, and you'll notice that we didn't dive super deep into tech or charts or other things like we usually do, because the performance of the Vivid truly speaks for itself. So let's just ditch these charts and hit the trails. All right, let me start the review of the Vivid by saying this. I thought that this shock was going to ride as if a RockShox Super Deluxe Air and a RockShox Super Deluxe Coil shock had a baby, but I ended up actually thinking something else. It kind of felt like its own thing, which is really cool, so let's talk about it. So for initial setup on the Vivid, I've ridden the Super Deluxe shocks quite a bit, and it's got the same adjustments as the RC2T damper on those, because this also has an RC2T damper as well. So setting it up was super easy. I just started with the compressions right in the middle, so high-speed compression right in the middle setting, low-speed compression right in the middle, neutral setting as well. And I started with the HBO setting all the way off because I wanted to see how it felt with the least amount of support, just to see how linear progressive this shock was. And I started with 2 volume spacers in it. Eventually removed those to see how it felt super linear. I'll talk about that too. But that was the initial setup. And in regards to getting sag, with 2 volume spacers in there, if I remember correctly, I had 145 PSI, which is about body weight, and that got me at 30% sag. Now, one thing to note with the Vivid when you're setting this up compared to other shocks is that the equalizer ports are actually further into the stroke than you'll generally see on other shocks. It's right around the 40% mark of the stroke. So when you are putting air pressure in it, you do have to equalize the shock, push on it real slowly to about that 40% mark. You'll feel it, hiss back and forth a little bit like normal, and just keep that in mind when you're setting up the actual air pressure. And also worth mentioning, a really cool feature, the rebound knob actually pulls right off, and it's got a 3mm Allen key on the backside you can use to adjust the high-speed compression and the adjustable hydraulic bottom out. So really cool feature. I like that. So I hit the trails, and we'll talk about the descending capabilities in a second, but a lot of people don't always mention the climbing characteristics of a shock like this, like a coil shock or a high volume air shock. They climb extremely well because you do have more traction when you're putting power through the pedals and climbing up and over and through weird routes and stuff. And this thing just feels really good. Lots of traction on the climbs, so that was great. And 2-position climb switch. When you lock this thing out, it is very firm, but not too firm. Felt nice to me. I'm not super picky on that stuff. But then I got to the top, and then I started descending. And that's when I really got to feel what this Vivid is all about. Where do I even start with this thing? Let me just say, to sum this thing up, this shock is badass going downhill. It is so good. It is amazing. When I went back to the shop after my first ride, gave everyone my brief rundown of how it felt, and that's exactly what I said. And I'll stick to it. Big bumps, little bumps, this thing just does it all very well. And if I had to use one word to describe how this thing just rides down or over on top of a trail, it just floats. It floats through rocks, it floats through roots and rough sections. Like I mentioned before, I thought it was going to feel kind of like a mix between the Super Deluxe Air and Coil, but it ended up actually feeling like its entirely own thing. So I think in the whole RockShox rear shock lineup, the Vivid kind of just holds its own place. It's not really an in-betweener of those 2 shocks. It just is the Vivid. This is the premium shock. It's got more oil, it's got bigger bushings, it's got less stiction overall, and it just feels amazing. Super tunable, and it just does everything very, very well. When I was riding downhill, I kind of felt like the whole trail would just turn into a pump track because the way that everything is tuned, the damper and the Debonair, high volume air can work together very, very seamlessly to make everything just feel extremely plush. Like extremely plush is a great tagline for this. I know a lot of people like to throw that around for rear suspension and forks as well, but it is directly applicable to the Vivid. Super plush. It's nice. So that touchdown technology basically bypasses the main piston's compression damping in the first 10% of its stroke, and it's super noticeable. I mean, not only on the shop floor, but in the trails, every single time you kind of lift off and touch down, it's super supple and transitions into that next stage, that like mid-stroke part. It does make it seem like I'm describing this as if there's like these different transitions that you can feel, because you got the first 10%, 10 to 80%, then the last 20% with the hydraulic bottom out, and it's all super seamless, extremely smooth, extremely plush, extremely coil-like. So if you're looking for that off-the-top sensitivity, the Vivid and that touchdown tech definitely works. It's not just a marketing term. It definitely is something that you can feel in a very positive way on the trail. And I gotta say, that's probably my favorite thing about this. So that every time you pump through something, it's super plush and supportive, and then you unload, land back on the ground, super smooth transition into landing into that mid-stroke again. And then of course, the adjustable hydraulic bottom out. I've talked about that in a bunch of videos, how valuable that is, and it comes in handy very much. And I've actually adjusted it a few different ways to match the area of where I was riding, and it just makes the shock so much more versatile. The Stump Jumper Evo, not the most progressive, suspension kinematics, and so the hydraulic bottom out and just being able to adjust the volume spacers has been very, very valuable, and just basically turned my trail bike into a way more capable descending machine. So I think that people that like to push the limits of what they can do on the trail bike are going to love this, and of course, obviously, the downhill bike riders and just enduro bikes as well. People are gonna love just riding this on their local trails and seeing if they can push their Strava times even faster. And then people that are racing, I think that the racers are going to be most stoked because it's just more versatile in the sense that you don't have to switch coil springs out and, just kind of like play the coil spring game when you are going to different types of terrain to race on. You can just set up the Vivid to match the terrain that you're traveling to for a race very easily. I think people are going to love that. It really makes you also just want to ride a little bit different, a little bit more low to the ground. I found myself actually slowing down my rebound on my setup a little more than I usually do. I actually went down a click on my fork to slow things down because it just makes everything feel super composed. And I really felt like I wanted to ride lower down, a little bit more aggressive in my actual stance, and just kind of like hug the ground a little bit more. This bike felt just, I think, faster with the Vivid compared to the Super Deluxe Air and Coil, and I really wasn't expecting that because I thought that it was going to feel kind of just like the Coil but a little bit more progressive. But the way that the whole air can tuning works with the damper combined, it just makes this shock feel like it just floats over everything. I have had so much fun riding this. I've only been riding it for a few weeks now, and this shock just handled everything so well. It really made the bike feel like it had a new level of descending capability, even I think compared to the Coil shock, but like in its own way. I don't think it's better than a Coil shock. I don't think it's better than the Super Deluxe Air because they're all different shocks made for different things. The Vivid is truly one of a kind in the RockShox lineup. I just really love how it rides. I think that it turns every bike into a more capable, bike than what it was even designed to be. And for that reason, I think people are gonna love this. So as I experimented with the shock, the settings that I landed on, I've been riding the past few rides, are -1 low-speed compression and -1 in the high-speed compression, and -1 in the hydraulic bottom out as well. So I've got things fairly soft and fairly open. I'm 150 pounds or so I don't need a ton of compression damping, and I felt like that all just felt really good. And one thing that sets a Coil shock apart from a shock like this, you can very quickly add or reduce some air pressure to make it softer or more firm, or you can add or remove volume spacers to make the shock more or less progressive depending on how you ride and where you're riding. So when I started off this test, I started with 2 volume spacers, and I felt like I didn't really need any of the hydraulic bottom out. I actually had it basically turned to the lightest setting, and it felt great. And then I just wanted to see how it would feel fully linear, to see how it felt when it's the most coil-like possible, and I took the volume spacers out. So right now, riding it, no volume spacers, fully linear, and I gotta say, it feels very coil-like, as you would imagine. And if I was going to go race somewhere and just wanted the most traction, I'd probably set this up with 0 or 1 volume spacers, just so I have the most usable travel and have this thing as linear and coil-like as possible. That's probably what I would do. And then here for my local trails, I'm actually gonna go back to the shop. I think I'm gonna put those 2 volume spacers back in there. Here on Galbraith, here in Bellingham, we don't have as much chunder, and our terrain is not as rough. And so I think that having those volume spacers spacers just helps me kind of just make the shock a little bit more progressive, gives me a little bit more of that pop, more similar to the Super Deluxe Air Shock, and I think just suits my riding style better at my local trails. So again, if I had a coil shock, I would have to buy a progressive spring. Those are over $100. Take the shock off, change it out, and it's just a little bit more of a pain in the butt. So Vivid, super convenient, super tunable, feels awesome. All right, so that's my personal review of how the RockShox Vivid feels on the trails. So let's head back to the shop and figure out if this shock is good for you and how you ride. Let's keep this short and sweet because again, the performance of the Vivid seriously speaks for itself. Due to just how controlled, smooth, and pillowy the shock feels on trail, combined with the easy yet extensive adjustability, I really feel like this is the new hot shock on the market. So let's answer the question. Is the Vivid the one shock to rule them all? In our opinion, yes it is for most riders with bikes over 130 millimeters of rear wheel travel that want a super premium rear shock that just floats through the rough terrain. However, let's expand on this a little more since shock choice is usually more of a conversational decision. There are a ton of rear shocks out there, but let's do some quick comparisons to the other models in the RockShox rear shock lineup. Those are the RockShox Super Deluxe Ultimate Coil and Air Shocks. Don't worry, we'll compare this to more shocks in the future. First, let's look at the RockShox Super Deluxe Air Shock. This has a smaller air can than the Vivid. Only certain models have the HBO feature, which is not adjustable, and it doesn't have that cool touchdown technology. This shock feels more progressive and just more poppy than the Vivid, and seems to ride higher in its travel more often. While the Vivid does require slightly less breakaway force, the Super Deluxe is no slouch and is still extremely impressive to get moving. The shock itself is physically smaller than the Vivid, which makes it easier to fit on more bikes that don't have as much clearance for larger shocks, while the Vivid's larger size holds more oil and larger bushings and seals, which will make it handle very long descents a bit better. It also weighs less than the Vivid and costs $100 less. Next, let's look at the RockShox Super Deluxe Coil Shock. Both of these shocks have the same damper adjustments, but the Vivid also has touchdown technology and is much more adjustable within the air spring. While the Vivid seeks to mimic the linear spring curve of a coil spring, a true coil shock is still going to be more linear if that's what you're looking for. If you want the Vivid to be more stiff or more soft, just add or remove a few PSI of air. To do this with a coil shock, you have to physically purchase a new spring and remove the shock from your bike to install it. Playing with coil spring rates can nickel and dime you with both your time and money, both before and after your shock purchase. If you want your Vivid to be more progressive, just pop some volume spacers in there. If you want your coil shock to be more progressive, again, you need to physically buy a progressive spring, which are usually over $100 each, and if you don't like that one, then you actually just have to buy another one. The sensitivity off the top of the stroke on both of these shocks is super sensitive, but the coil shock will still slightly win this battle naturally. However, I really think the Vivid's sensitivity will feel almost identical to most riders on the trail thanks to that touchdown technology. The coil shock weighs more than the Vivid and also costs less, assuming that your first spring works for you. However, it's not uncommon to have to purchase several springs to find the right one for you, and that can add up. I really don't mean to scare anyone away from buying a coil shock, but in reality, buying several coil springs and playing with spring rates is a serious concern of our customers, which shouldn't be ignored. If you're very coil curious, I definitely recommend experiencing a coil shock to see if this is something you really like. Understanding the process of playing with physical coil spring rates and feeling how they change the riding characteristics on the trail is very valuable, and you can learn a lot about what type of suspension you like. Or if your heart and brain aren't exactly polarized towards going with either an air or coil shock, and you just want something that is super adjustable with a super plush and premium feeling on the trail, the Vivid is going to make you very happy. Because while it does feel like it falls into its own category of shock type, it really does offer the best of both worlds. So which shock is best for you? If you prioritize keeping your bike lightweight, you like your suspension to be very progressive to ride high in its travel and give you the most pop, or you just want a shock that performs absolutely amazing at the lowest price, then you should probably go with the RockShox Super Deluxe Ultimate Air Shock. If you prioritize traction, you want a shock that is as linear as possible to have more usable travel, you don't mind adding weight to your bike, and you don't mind playing with coil springs to find one that works best for you and your bike, then the RockShox Super Deluxe Coil Ultimate is an amazing value compared to other similar coil shocks in the market. Now let's talk about the Vivid. The Vivid is for you if you want virtually the same traction and sensitivity as a coil shock, but with more adjustability and versatility since you won't need to physically change coil springs. The Vivid is for you if you want a shock that feels as plush and pillowy as possible but doesn't add much weight to your bike, and can still be set up either more progressive for more support and pop, or more linear for more usable travel by simply switching out some volume spacers. The Vivid's versatility can up the descending game of your 140mm trail bike, but this same shock can be used to smash out bike park laps on your 200mm DH bike. With that said, the Vivid is sure to please a ton of riders looking for a super premium, ultra high performance shock with tons of adjustability. The only thing that's kind of a bummer about this shock is that I just put out a video on testing a bunch of different shocks on my Stumpjumper Evo, and was raving about how I'm gonna, be picking between the RockShox Super Deluxe Air or Coil shock. And then, I'm not kidding, the day after we put that video out, this new Vivid showed up, and now I'm extremely excited about this, and this is probably gonna be the shock that I'm gonna be using on my Stumpjumper Evo moving forward. So if you guys were watching that video series and now you're watching this one, and you have a Stumpy Evo and you're looking at these, I actually think that this is the best choice for this bike. It feels really good. HBO, more progressive with the volume spacers, the sheer tunability, and just plush, pillowy feeling. It fits this bike really well. So, sorry about that, guys. Showed up a little late. All right, well, there you have it. That is the all-new RockShox Vivid. Now, obviously, we are very excited about this shock, but we want to know what you guys think. Let us know your thoughts on the new RockShox Vivid in the comments below. We're going to have these things available to buy at our website, thelostco.com, and you can call or email us if you have any questions on suspension or anything else mountain bike related. If you like this video, tell us we did a good job by hitting that thumbs up button. If you really like this video and want to see more videos like this, subscribe to our channel, hit that bell notification so that you don't miss out on future videos. Until next time, I'm going to go riding because it's summer and this shock feels awesome. So we'll see you next time.